Hey everybody, happy Monday. Thanks so much for joining. Get started in just a second here. As always, there's some things I want to start talking about, just what's been going on with the campaign, um, and what we've been doing, and then just kind of some topical news stuff. And then we've got some questions that have already come in. We'll answer those first, and then you can just put your questions in the chat if you have them. Excuse me. And we'll get through those as we go through the hour. So thanks so much for joining. I want to talk a little bit about what's happened in the last week. So one thing that I especially want to call out is that on Saturday, on July 4th, I joined another Black Lives Matter protest and rally that took place in Wilmington at the Friends Meeting House in the city of Wilmington. I think what's so important to recognize is that people are still turning out for these events in large numbers. They're still raising their voices and they're still demanding change. And it may have seemed to have faded from the news cycle, but that doesn't mean that people aren't out there. And I think that's so important for us to remember because we are absolutely seeing sustained calls for change in response to police brutality and police violence and racial injustice in our country. And there were, I would estimate, at least 100 people or so that showed up to this event on Saturday and lined two sides of a kind of busy corridor and street in the city and chanted and rallied and protested and demanding change and recognizing that Black Lives Matter. And people drove by honking in their support. Virtually every single car that went by honked in their support. So I think it's incredibly important that we continue to talk about how this movement is sustaining and how people are not going home. People are not taking small incremental changes as a reason to go home. They're not taking performative gestures as a reason to go home. They are staying out in the streets every week to continue saying we need to see real change. And, we've talked a lot about the change that I would like to see, and I know that the people that I've spoken to in Wilmington would like to see. And it's not simply about body cameras or training. It's really much bigger than that. We're beyond that point, and the calls for change are beyond that point because people recognize that the reasons that lead to safety in a community are not just policing. You're safer and your community is safer when your community is healthier, when it's well educated, when you have jobs where you're well paid. And those are the things that people are demanding. When housing is affordable and safe, these are the things that actually make a community safe. And, there's something that is kind of in the news recently, is that Wilmington City Council in particular has pushed for civilian oversight boards. So what are those? It's basically a board that comes together of civilians outside of council people or outside of the police apparatus to be able to review actions or infractions or behavior by officers in the community. And Wilmington in particular has a history of racist police brutality. When we are out there protesting and marching for Black Lives Matter, we're talking about not just national incidents. We're talking about things that have happened in our own state and in our own city. And I'm really glad that the council people are continuing to advocate for these things. Councilman Johnson in particular has made a point that if we're going to create something like a civilian review board, it has to have real power. It needs to actually be able to do something. It can't just be toothless oversight. It can't be symbolic, a group of people that actually aren't able to take any real action. But this has been going on for a really long time, trying to institute these types of boards, and it still hasn't passed. And part of that is because of the impact of the power of the police advocacy groups and union groups that are deeply entrenched in politics nationally, but as well as locally on our state and local politics here in Delaware. And there's a real fear about crossing that power and pushing back against that power. And we really need to focus on electing people who haven't taken money from those groups and who are able to kind of stand separate from them and recognize that we need to be able to push back on the power that exists and is coming from those groups right now. You know, civilian review boards are a good idea, but much like body cameras, they are only in place to react when something has happened. You know, we have seen that body cameras have not stopped police brutality. We have some footage of police brutality because of body cameras. Same thing goes for a civilian review board. It's not going to stop police brutality. It can potentially react and deliver some form of an enforcement or punishment for it, but it's not going to save someone's life. And that's really what we have to think about, is how do we actually save people's lives? How do we break down this racist structure of policing? You know, a lot of the things that have been called for or have been changed, like chokehold bans, have been in place in other places for decades, and they haven't stopped police brutality. Cops are still using them. Making things illegal or banned has not proven to stop the use of them, nor has it proven that people will actually be punished for using them. You know, I really think that we have to recognize that something like reform is still not going to get us away from police brutality. You know, we might see incremental small improvements, but, you know, when we have things that are championing like a 70% reduction in police brutality, I think we have to recognize that we can't be okay with 25 to 30% acceptable level of police brutality. We need to be working towards zero, and we can't be enacting policies that say we are willing to accept any level of police brutality. And I think that is where some of the reforms and trainings and review systems that people are talking about, that is where they land. They're landing in a place where we're still saying some level of brutality is acceptable. And I think we have to think bigger than that and absolutely be targeting a zero police brutality. Something else I want to talk about is a national story that's kind of hitting close to home. The National Labor Relations Board under Donald Trump is working to kill what's called the contract bar doctrine. And I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but basically what that means is it's a precedent, legal precedent, that says once you execute and sign a union contract and put that contract into effect, another challenge or election cannot be performed until that contract expires. And that's usually a 3-year window. And the reason for that is that it protects workers from not having to constantly re-vote for their union to continue to exist, because that is what right-wing groups and right-to-work groups are trying to do. They can take their massive amounts of funding and constantly try to push for union decertification votes over and over. And that drains the union's resources, it weakens their power, it drains the energy that workers have to continue to fight for their union, constantly being asked to vote over and over whether they still want to be in that union. So frankly, it would even hurt companies. I mean, I don't know how they don't recognize that this will destabilize their relationship with their unions, the relationship with their workforce. But I think that comes from a lot of companies just seeing their workers and their work and the people who work for them as expendable and replaceable. So the reason that this is interesting is because it is actually coming from, or it's happening in our state. When we talked about a few weeks ago visiting and attending a rally for the UFCW union, who represents workers at the Mount Air chicken processing plant, this is an example that the National Labor Relations Board is trying to use to enact this change. So this is happening in our own state, and we have an opportunity to stand up for this union and to voice our displeasure, and calling for actually supporting unions. Like, we have talked about this a lot, how it's incredibly important to build labor power in our country, that will help us fight for a stronger democracy, ensure that we have a government that actually represents all people. That power can be obtained through building labor power. So we cannot allow changes like this to further break down the bit of power that unions still have in our country. I mean, this has been systemic for decades now, well over my lifetime, the work that corporations and right-wing interests have put into breaking down union power. And this is yet another example that is happening right here at home. So I think it's incredibly important that we stand up for unions and we call this out when it's happening. And we fight back against the things that will weaken unions, force them to waste time and money fighting for their contract over and over rather than fighting for the rights of their workers. All right. One other thing I did last week, just to hit on again on Saturday, attended an event with some other candidates at the Sanctuary Baptist Fellowship Church in Bear. So it was great to spend some time there, get to see other candidates who are running, have conversations about the races they're running, and it's always nice to talk to other candidates, get some advice about how they're running in the midst of a pandemic. Big thank you to the organizers of putting that event on, making food available for people who need it, making clothing and household items available for people who need it to come and take as they needed for free. And I had some good conversations there, one of which, really stuck out was, again, about the thing that I feel like almost every conversation either starts at or ends up coming back to, and that's about healthcare. Talking to a medical professional who works at a long-term care facility, and the things that he encounters, the frustrations that he encounters with having to work through private insurance companies, making calls to insurance companies to get what's called prior authorization on medications that you or I could walk into Walgreens and purchase. They have to do that work. It's administrative time that our medical professionals have to take out of their ability to give care to their patients and spend on the phone being pushed from representative to representative at the insurance company, wasting their time and their energy asking for permission to deliver the care that they know their patient needs. And this is something that I don't think we really talk about enough. It's like the administrative waste that exists in our current system that we pay for to essentially have a company potentially deny the care that our medical professional is recommending. And this was someone who experiences that firsthand, day in and day out. It takes hours out of his day that he could otherwise be treating patients or ensuring that people are staying healthy, but instead he's back in an office, on the phone, on hold, waiting to get approval from the insurance company to use often medications or procedures that are otherwise widely available. So that was another reason, yet another anecdote that kind of goes into the reasons of why I believe and will continue to fight for Medicare for all in our country. We need a truly universal healthcare system that takes these middlemen out of the decisions that are being made about our health between us and our doctors. All right, so let's start talking about some questions. So Selvum asked, can a small business handle a change in minimum wage? So I think that's a really good question, and it's definitely one that's come up before, because I'm talking about the need for at least a $15 minimum wage in our state and our country. And I think that we've seen in places where the minimum wage has increased that they can handle it. However, I think that we have to not be fearful of that. And I think that we have consistently provided federal subsidies to the biggest mega corporations in our country. They're constantly getting tax breaks and stimulus dollars and money from our public resources. And we could absolutely shift the businesses that we support. We could instead say, if there are small businesses who when that transition happens to $15 an hour, can't quite pay their workers a living wage yet, that is a place where we can step in to fill that gap and ensure that those workers are being paid a living wage. But what we've seen is when you do raise the minimum wage, often the economic benefits are enough to create more customers for a small business. So if you own a shop and now everyone who lives around your shop is actually making enough money that they might have some money left over at the end of the month, they have that expendable income that they can come and spend with you. So raising the minimum wage actually increases economic activity as well. So I think there's that fact, as well as the ability for the federal government to think about how do we actually subsidize small business, the people who truly need it, rather than these massive mega corporations who are able to sustain their businesses on their own. Or frankly, raise money from other ways, like selling their own stocks from their shareholders. I think we can have a government that thinks and focuses more on the individual and the small business rather than the massive corporation. Okay, so Teresa asks, what are your thoughts on immigration? Another great question that comes up a lot. I believe that we should be welcoming all immigrants in our country. I mean, particularly because we have seen that our foreign policy has worked to destabilize other countries and actually drive up requests for asylum and immigration due to the political and economic and frankly even climate-based hardship that people are facing in the countries that they are coming from. I think we need to expand refugee programs and have, we have quotas and numbers or maximums on those refugee programs that could absolutely be increased. We should be offering asylum to people and not sending them back to countries where they literally fear for their lives, and ensuring that a pathway to citizenship is actually attainable to every immigrant in this country. Because for quite a few people, the sheer cost of becoming a citizen are out of reach. And if we can absolutely change that and ensure that it is something that is accessible for every immigrant in this country, I think we have to absolutely protect dreamers or DACA recipients. It's incredibly important. And I think we have to find ways to expand those protections to all undocumented people in our country. I believe in ending the mass deportations that are happening in our country. I mean, we have seen deportations happening in our state in the midst of a pandemic. We are sending people, we're breaking up families, sending people back to countries that often they don't even really know is home in the middle of a public health crisis. So ending mass deportations, closing the camps that we are holding people in at our borders, and abolishing ICE that acts as a paramilitary force, again, tracking down and breaking up families and causing immigrants in our country to live in fear unnecessarily. All right. Another question from Teresa. How will you look out for seniors? This is another great question. I really believe that every single person deserves living wages for their entire life. And that means, yes, increasing minimum wage to $15 an hour, but it also means expanding Social Security and increasing funding to the Older Americans Act. So Social Security right now, I have talked to far too many seniors who retired and were trying to live on Social Security and had to go back to work. A 75-year-old man who started driving a bus for an after-school program because he could not get by on Social Security. This is someone who had already worked, more than 40 years of his life, and we're asking him to go back to work. And I think that is completely indefensible. People have the right to retire and not constantly have to work to simply meet their own basic needs. So expanding Social Security is incredibly important to me. We also have a Medicare system that I know we talk about expanding Medicare for all, but what's really important that we continue to talk about is that yes, we're calling it Medicare for all, but it's not Medicare in its current state because Medicare in its current state is not sufficient. You know, I've talked to seniors who are on Medicare and who still can't afford their prescriptions, who can't afford the additional parts of Medicare that give them that coverage. So while we use Medicare for all as a term, it really is about actually making Medicare a truly comprehensive healthcare system that is covering everything that's medical, mental, dental, vision, and hearing, addiction treatment, long term care. Like anything that is healthcare related needs to be covered by Medicare for all, including home based care or community based long term care, as well as prescription drugs. And we absolutely need to be curtailing the price of prescription drugs, which are completely out of control. You know, I may have shared this story, but within the last couple weeks, I spoke to a Delawarean who was spending $500 out of pocket on an IV antibiotic that he needed to survive. In addition to that, he was diabetic and required insulin that cost him over $1,200 for a 3 month supply. This is a person living on a fixed income. And he's every month having to make decisions about feeding himself, keeping a roof over his head, paying bills, or paying for the medication that he needs to survive. And we do not have to force people to live this way. So expanding Medicare would also support seniors who are struggling to get by even on that program now, because we need to turn it into a truly comprehensive program. I think another thing that seniors are facing that's incredibly important and does not get talked about enough is housing instability. You know, no one should be facing eviction or foreclosure in this country because they can't afford a place to live. No one, we can absolutely end the problem of homelessness in our country. And I think this is incredibly true for seniors who maybe have, you know, this is another story where I spoke to a woman in her 60s who has lived in the same townhouse for more than 25 years. But the owners of that townhouse development decided to sell it. And the owners, the new owners, want to rehab all the units and increase the rents. So this woman was told that her rent was going to increase by 60%. And she got that notification with about 2 or 3 months notice. So she was going from paying $1,000 a month to $1,600 a month. Again, person on a fixed income who's also raising her grandchild or just trying to get them through college so that they can get out on their own. And she is now facing housing instability and had no idea where she was going to be able to move to. After living in the same place for 25 years and calling that home, facing this instability and knowing that she's going to struggle to find a place that she can pay for $1,000 a month, which is what she can afford. So we absolutely need to guarantee universal housing and ensure that no one is experiencing what that woman is experiencing. And that's a big reason why I have taken the Universal Homes Guarantee pledge and pledged to fight for universal housing in our country. Right. All right, so Amy asked, or says, change is good and good open-minded leadership. What would you change and why? So I think, you know, a lot of the policies that I've talked about are certainly a change. You know, we don't have people in our state who are championing universal healthcare and universal housing, free public education from pre-K all the way through trade school and college, economic justice, and ending white supremacy and true racial justice, as well as environmental and climate justice. And I think beyond that policy focus, the other thing that I really want to bring to this seat and to this Senate is how you wield the power that comes with it and the platform that comes with it. Because it's not enough to just vote the right way on bills down in Washington. I really think that what we have to think about is how do we actually empower activists who are doing the work on the ground to change policy and people's minds? How do you ensure that labor organizers have what they need to organize workplaces and that we clear their path to actually ensure that workers can gain power in the workplace? And how one of the biggest things that we're only, I think, starting to see a little bit more recently is helping other campaigns, like truly building a movement of people who are committed to the same goals, who are committed to the same vision of the future, of remaking Americans' expectations for what our country can actually be, and fighting to get those people elected as well. Because it's not enough to have one Senate seat or two or even three for this vision. We have to keep winning more and more seats. And I think that is something that I am absolutely committed to build the power that we need to see change. Because I recognize that it's not enough to have a single person. A single person can start a movement and can push it, but we will really truly see change when we get enough elected people who believe in this vision and enough elected people who recognize that it's important to build the political mandate outside of Washington, D.C., from the grassroots, and people calling and demanding for the things that they need to see in their lives to improve their lives. I think the other thing that's important is, we've made a commitment to say that our hiring practices will be incredibly focused on hiring people in our Senate office who are from the communities that we most intend to represent. So ensuring that it's truly Delawareans, working people, people of color, lower income people who have not had enough representation in our government, who are filling those roles in our Senate office, because I think it's incredibly important to stay connected to working people back home and not solely surround yourself with corporate interests and lobbying interests and people who have been in Washington for their entire careers, because I think that that is what will start to sort of influence the policy that comes out of the office. So I think it's incredibly important to actually hire people from the communities that we want to write policy for and who are going to be able to weigh in on what that policy should look like because of their personal experiences. So Susan says, I'm concerned about Medicare for All if the Supreme Court shoots down the ACA. And I understand, Republicans and the Trump administration have been making attacks on people's healthcare, even beyond the ACA, for this entire administration and years before it. And it's scary because there are things that the ACA have put in place that have made it easier for people to get healthcare. There is no doubt. I mean, I think that it is not enough, particularly when we're talking about the marketplace side of the ACA. The plans that are available in the ACA marketplace are often still out of reach for a whole lot of people. Even with subsidies, people are getting plans that they can't even afford to use from the ACA. But there are incredibly important pieces of the ACA, like getting rid of the concept of pre-existing conditions, getting rid of the concept of lifetime limits. Those types of legislative policy pieces are incredibly important to ensuring that people can get health insurance plans and ideally the care that they need. I think a little bit going back to what I was talking about a little bit before, where like the job is to build that political mandate. The shift that we've seen on Medicare for All in just the, I would say, last 4 years has been, I think, dramatic. We went from it being a concept that a lot of people just kind of scoffed at and said could never be possible here, to being something that a large amount of presidential candidates ran on, a large amount of federal candidates are running on, and a lot more people are convinced that healthcare is a right and are willing to fight for it. And I think we have to build on that. there has been a version of this bill or this idea that has come up in the House in particular for years, but we've only seen national traction happen more recently. And I think what we have to think about is like, how do we keep making that case? And how do we build support at the ground level? And how do we get some people into the program? Like, where are ways that we can bring people in, and where are ways that we can bring in more candidates who will fight for it? Because I do truly believe that, much like Medicare and Social Security, once people experience these programs, they are not going to want them to be taken away. And they will fight tooth and nail for that program to stay as part of what their government offers them as a way to take care of them and their needs. So I think that it's really about ensuring that people will fight for it and pushing something through that gets people the experience. That's why, honestly, this pandemic, it could have been an opportunity to say, we're going to extend Medicare to every single person in this country during this pandemic, so that people can actually have an experience and not have the only idea or concept of it in their mind be what naysayers have put out as talking points. And that, I think, is what we have to fight for, is how do we start making progress on this program so that people will champion it and demand it and fight tooth and nail to prevent it being taken away from them. I just noticed my battery is dying. I have been on calls since, I don't know, 5:30 today. So I'm going to run and grab my charger. I'm really sorry for this interruption. I'll be right back in a second. Sorry about that. All right. A real look behind the curtain. All right, so Dave asks, if elected, will you blindly support the party's leaders, or will you continue to fight for the people? So I've talked a little bit about how I really try to talk about this campaign and the things that we're fighting for, I think maybe differently than has been talked about in the past. I've talked about how I've had conversations with people who are Republicans and got them to sort of be open to some of the things I was talking about by talking about the fact that we can't just be having a left versus right fight, and we really need to find ways to bring ourselves together and recognize that this is much more of a top versus bottom fight. So I have been committed from the beginning to say, if elected, I will be serving and legislating in favor of people and working people and not corporations and the wealthy. I think the stance on the party leaders for me, is that I want to see their commitment to fighting for the policy that I ran on to get elected. And that will be what is the deciding factor for me. Like, it's not, I mean, you use the word blindly. Like, I don't think my intention would be to blindly support anything. My intention would be to analyze each position or person and say, where can we find common ground that is actually benefiting working people? And that is not simply just towing the party line every single time. I don't want to make decisions that are simply politically expedient or make my life easier, because I recognize that there's going to be a lot of fights to champion the policy that I'm running on, but my commitment is to stay committed to that policy. And my votes for leaders and other people in positions of power will be focused on what are the policy that you're willing to fight for and are committed to fighting for, and do we align on that? And I think anytime that I am looking to find common ground with someone, it has to be very much about staying true to the principles that I've defined for myself and not bending on those pieces. Like, there are ways to find common ground with people who don't share every single view of yours, but the last thing that we need are more people who are just going to Washington with the goal of solely compromising, even when that compromise seems to break their values, seems to harm the people who the laws actually affect. And that's the commitment that I'm making, to not take actions that result in compromise on the backs of the most vulnerable people in our country. All right. Valu asks, do you have plans on helping former felons, and how? I think this is incredibly important. Um, so, as a whole, I think we need a more restorative criminal justice system in general. Right now, we have an incredibly punitive system that focuses on solely punishment and rather and avoids any concept of rehabilitation. Um, there are not nearly enough programs in place that make reentry from prison or from some sort of incarceration smooth. And I think that has led to a lot of people, after serving their term, still struggling to stay out of jail. You know, something I saw today was I was reading a study that kind of showed what were the reasons that after someone was released from prison, if they ended up back in the system, what was it? And the vast majority of them were technicalities. It wasn't committing another crime. It was something happened and they got tripped up and they maybe had a parole or probation violation. And that is so easy. And all it reminded me of is this conversation that has stuck with me from canvassing this winter, where I was speaking to a person who had a felony charge in the past, and he said they make it so easy to get in and incredibly difficult to get out, because he experienced that. He got out of prison, but then needed to have a job to be able to meet his parole obligations, but didn't have his license back and had to use public transportation to get to a minimum wage job that he's trying to raise a family on. And if that bus was late or he missed a transfer, his job is in jeopardy. And that means his freedom is also in jeopardy. So I think we really need to look at what do those reentry programs look like, and how do we ensure that we aren't punitively seeking to lock people back up when they are trying and they are simply running into all of the systemic barriers that make it hard to avoid tripping up. I think we need to remove workplace discrimination against former felons, barring employers from asking about felony convictions on work applications. And I think, again, getting back to reentry, like, I think we need more federal funding that goes toward reentry programs. I also think that we should not be disenfranchising people who are imprisoned. I mean, we have seen that here in Delaware. Even though our laws have changed and people who have felony charges are able to re-register to vote, many people don't know that. I mean, we saw that as we were canvassing neighborhoods and just talking to people on the street. People who tell us, oh, I can't vote because I have a felony. No one ever told them that the law changed. So I don't believe that we should be taking the right to vote away from people. And I believe that we should be doing more, particularly in our state of Delaware, to communicate to people that they have the right to vote, and how do we get you re-registered and how do we get you involved in this process? Because that is just another way that we marginalize people and take away their voices and their rights that is completely unnecessary. Susan asked, will we be in Sussex County at some time? Yeah, I was there a couple times just a few weeks ago. I know that some kind of Sussex-based groups have invited me to speak virtually, so I've done some kind of Zoom calls, which have been great. But if there are any events in particular that you want to invite me to, whether they are virtual or in person, please reach out. I will absolutely do my best to be there, and you know, either I'm willing to speak or I'm willing to just attend and listen and hear from people. Whatever you think is right, I will absolutely make the time to be in Sussex. All right, so Katie asks, kind of big question here. So many in the country are adamantly anti science with regard to climate and COVID, for example. I would argue it's not enough to simply support science based views, but instead demand a plan of action to shift the nation's sentiment, particularly by exposing bad actors such as the oil industry, billionaires who have an agenda that aren't in the best interest of citizens, and conspiracy theorists who are spreading lies. How do you plan to attack these bad actors and then realign the nation's sentiment to something that isn't an embarrassment to the rest of the world? This is a really good question, and I think I agree with the point entirely. Um, I think what I try to do, I mean, this is why one on one conversations are incredibly important, particularly ones that aren't happening online, because I think it's really easy for people to sort of retreat to their corners when you're in a space like Twitter or Facebook. Um, I think what is incredibly important is having individual conversations with people and trying to find that hook that you can have with them to start from. Because even if you don't, I hate to say believe in climate change because there's no not believing in it. Even if you I don't like the concept of not believing in something that we've been able to prove is true. But even if you are going to be opposed to it or opposed to taking any action on it, I think there are a lot of people who hold that view, but still recognize that there's other problems. So that maybe they aren't making wages that they can survive on. Or maybe they had making good wages, but they haven't gone up. And now it's harder to buy the things that they need to survive, and they feel that pinch. Maybe they have a workplace that's not safe. Um, there are, so I think we can find those hooks and then talk particularly about how a Green New Deal can solve some of those problems. If you want to talk about actually, if you're the type of person who wants to believe in, American exceptionalism and our leadership in the world, well, then why would we not be leaders on climate? Why would we not see this as an opportunity to lead the charge in creating the technology and the infrastructure that's necessary to combat climate change? I'm not saying it will necessarily work with every person, but these are some of the ways that I would be thinking through this conversation. And then we could talk about the fact that there's a federal jobs guarantee included in the Green New Deal. Because if you're a parent who's worried about the prospects that your child has, maybe they're graduating from high school or college and they're in their 20s and they haven't quite found a job that they can truly survive on, then talking about how the Green New Deal actually provides for that, like good paying jobs guaranteed to anyone who wants one, that's maybe an angle you can take. I think most people know that our infrastructure is crumbling, and Green New Deal and attacking climate change head on is incredibly important to that aspect. Most people see that as something we should be addressing regardless of what party they're in. They believe we should be investing in our infrastructure. We shouldn't have bridges that people drive on daily that we know are failing. We should have high-speed internet across our entire country. There are things there that I think you can try to find the hook with someone and try to bring them along. But I do think these are the types of things that have to happen more so in personal conversations. Um, it's a lot harder to have those conversations with a broader audience, because I think there's that retreating that happens when it's kind of more of a mass communication. But those are things I think that like both individuals can do as well as elected officials could be using their power to do. All right, so Amy says Medicare is rough on the prior authorization problem, which is something I was talking about at the beginning. She notes she was dying from lack of a continuous glucose monitor and took 2 years of fighting to get approval. And how do we change Medicaid insurance rules for easier prior authorizations to lower doctor's office overhead with lower costs overall? This is a great point. I mean, the administrative costs and the overhead costs, like so much of that is a significant portion of our healthcare costs in our country. And it's a significant portion to doctors' offices being able to operate. Um, Instead of delivering care and being able to make the choices that they need to make to care for their patients, we have doctors that are spending time on the phone with this for-profit bureaucratic insurance industry that's acting as a middleman to deny us care. And ultimately, this insurance industry that we are paying large premiums to and co-pays to, they are not adding value to the system that they participate in because of these administrative weights that they put on doctors' offices, because of the fact that they literally profit off of denying us care. When they have to pay for our health care, they make less money. So if their goal is to create value for their shareholders, which it is as a corporation, the tools that they have to do that are to deny healthcare to individuals. And that is why we really need to remove this motive for profit, this drive for profit from our healthcare systems. Like, we need to have a single payer system that is focused on delivering care, not a for-profit system that is focused on making profits for shareholders in the business of sometimes approving people for the healthcare that they need. I mean, this is not a radical idea that is out of step with the mainstream. It exists in the rest of the industrialized world. We know that it is broadly popular across the country, and particularly in our state. So we need to keep fighting for it. And we need to recognize that what we are doing now is actually the irrational thing. It's the economically unsustainable thing. And we could have a system that both saves lives and saves money. Until we get there, there need to be, I think, statewide options that, some of our state level candidates are focused on. Things like buy-ins for Medicaid, so that even if you don't qualify, you have the option to buy into a better system that is not a for-profit insurance program that you probably can't afford, as well as consistently ensuring that our current Medicare and Medicaid systems are properly funded, rather than having people who talk about their fear of the deficit and how we might have to think about cutting funding to these programs that we rely on to survive. So Garrett asks, when you're elected, you'll easily be among the top 5 most progressive U.S. senators. With that in mind, do you believe more Democrats in that body can be pulled left, specifically on Medicare for All? And if so, what's your angle in that conversation? I absolutely believe that some can. I think it goes back to what we were talking about, is like, how do you build political will and political mandate from the ground level? Because there are a lot of people who are elected officials who kind of wait to see the seas change, and then we'll make the decision. And I think that comes from a concern about maintaining the seat, which we can argue about as a separate conversation. I think worrying about keeping your seat without worrying about reasons that would give people a reason to continue to vote for you to keep your seat. Probably the wrong focus. But I do think there are people there that if we build the groundswell of push, which I believe we already are, and we're working there, like they will come along to this already incredibly popular policy. But I know there's some who just can't. And I think those are the people who we should be challenging and running primaries against. And I think that we can use the power of a Senate seat and the platform that it gives us, the people who will be engaged with our campaign, to build a grassroots energy for the next person who wants to run. You know, my campaign right now is talking to a lot of groups of people who have worked on other progressive or left candidate campaigns. And we're trying to bring those people into the fold because what we saw, I mean, I mentioned it at the top, I believe, that, you know, we made, or I may not have mentioned it. Anyway, we had a phone banking session yesterday where we made more than 11,000 calls on a single day. And that is because we had about 20 to 30 people actively calling for about a 2-hour period. And that's what pushes you over the top. Having that organized army of volunteers who can be deployed to do this work. So I think it's not just about getting one person elected. It's also about who are the people who are standing in the way of progress, and how do we use the power that we've built to win that one seat to win the next one. And I think it's about running in every race. I mean, as I said before, there are independents and there are Republicans who recognize that the problem is with catering to corporations and powerful moneyed interests. And if you can make that argument to people, if you can recognize that working people as a whole are more aligned with each other than they are with the ultra wealthy, that's where we're going to build power from. And I think that means that's why we have to run for every seat and run on unabashedly progressive or people focused, whatever you want to call it, policies, because that is what engages people. I mean, we have seen that with this campaign. We have inspired people to change their party affiliation so they can vote for this platform. We have inspired hundreds of volunteers to join us and canvass and phone bank and text and do all of the work that goes into running a campaign. And we have people who are raising their hand and saying, I've never been involved in something like this, but I'm happy you are running and I want to be involved for that reason. So we know that when you actually talk to people about the things that are happening in their lives and propose fighting to change those things and fix those problems, that is what gets people engaged. And I don't think that we should be fearful about whether this works in a red district or a blue district or whatever it might be. Because I think when you actually talk to people's conditions and needs, a lot of that fades away and it becomes much more about who's going to fight for us. And that is what people, I think, are dying for. And it's what actually makes people fight to get someone into a seat. So Griffin asked a question about Medicare for All. Traditional Medicare only covers about 80% of allowable charges. Would your definition of Medicare for All cover 100% of charges, or would one have to purchase supplemental insurance policy to cover the rest? I talked a little bit about this before. Like, it's frustrating because Medicare for All is not Medicare in its current form. We absolutely need to supplement what Medicare is and increase it to truly be comprehensive. So the version of Representative Jayapal's bill lays it out as being truly a single payer system, similar to systems that exist in countries like Germany and France, that removes the private insurance system and replaces it with a comprehensive medical, dental, mental health, vision, hearing, addiction services, all sort of medical services, comprehensive coverage, no fee when you go to receive that service. That is what I am fighting for. Right. Robert asks, what are your views on the national deficit and on deficit spending? Um, so we have seen how fear of deficit turning to austerity worsens the deficit. It slows down economic development and it actually worsens the deficits and increases them. And the International Monetary Fund, who frankly was a champion of austerity, has conducted research that has shown this. And they have since changed their view that austerity is actually bad and harms economies and harms people. I look at it from the perspective of what are we using deficits to do? Because we have a sovereign currency, which means our country can never go bankrupt. We are always able to pay our debts. And any dollar that is in our hands is technically a deficit. It is a dollar that the government created, put into the economy, and did not get back. So any dollar that's actually circling in our economy and that I'm using to buy things or pay someone a wage is a dollar that's technically a deficit because the government did not return it. So the dollars that the government put into the economy are actually what fund economic growth. And if we care about having a strong and stable economy, it means putting money directly into the hands of working people, because those are the people who put that money back into the economy and who pay their taxes with it. And that money cycles a lot more than putting money into the hands of the extremely wealthy who sit on it and who have more than they could ever actually spend. So I really believe that the federal government should be spending money on people and on people-focused policies that better the lives of people in our country, that it should not be going to tax breaks for the already wealthy. It should not be going to fund endless war, or frankly, what that means is putting our public money in the hands of defense contractors and their shareholders, again, already incredibly wealthy. We should be spending on programs that actually, frankly, pay for themselves. When you have something like Medicare for All, we will save money. We will spend less on our healthcare system than we are spending today by almost $500 million every single year. When you have something like free public childcare, free public childcare has shown to have economic outcomes that are incredibly positive for that child who got that childcare. Same thing goes for free public college. When you invest in free public college, you create people who have more earning potential, who can better contribute to the economy in the future. So I really see it as what are we using deficits for? How are we controlling inflation? And how are we ensuring that we create an economy that's people focused? Those are the things we should be focused on, not worrying about whether we balanced a budget, because the federal government does not need to be run like our household budget or even like a state budget or like a business budget. We have the power to spend in a way that benefits people's lives. And this idea that any deficit that's being incurred is the burden of a future generation is simply not true. Okay, there are a lot of questions here, and I'm sorry that we're not going to get to them all. But I'm going to hit one last one, and it's from Ryan of what are some key areas that you differ from Senator Coons, and how do you plan to defeat him in the upcoming primary? So, frankly, a lot of what I've been talking about is the differences. My agenda and policy proposals are incredibly focused on working people and legislating in favor of lifting up working people, ensuring that every single person in our country has a strong foundation that they can jump off of to have a good, dignified life. I reject all corporate PAC money, whereas Senator Coons is very heavily funded by corporations, particularly pharmaceutical companies, student loan companies, and we see how that affects his legislation. When he votes against importing drugs from Canada, when he champions programs that are not tuition-free public college, when he laughs at that idea. I support Medicare for All. He does not. 68% of Delawareans support Medicare for all, yet he still does not. I support a $15 minimum wage that is tied to inflation. He believes that a $15 minimum wage is too high, which I have not heard from any single person who's working and trying to get by in our state. I support a Green New Deal, which he has laughed at and called wild-eyed. I support a housing guarantee, which he does not. And as I talked about before, I intend to use this seat differently. You know, it is not enough to just go to Washington and vote the right way and not work to build power and work to champion other candidates and work to fight for issue-based campaigns and work to make the work that activists are doing and organizers are doing back home easier. And that's how I plan to lead differently. The way that we defeat him is by, right now, because we can't knock on doors, phone banking, which I think is a kind of a great segue to a little bit of a close. You know, it's important that we keep growing our volunteer team. I mentioned that, you know, there are hundreds of people that have raised their hand to volunteer, but not every single one of them is available every day. But it's important that we talk to voters every single day. So we need to keep growing that team until the election on September 15th. So if you want to join that team, be one of the people who gets to tell Delawareans that they can expect more and fight for more from their government, you can go to justfordelaware.com/volunteer to sign up. You know, we're in the final quarter of this campaign. This is the time to build momentum. I don't want to be a campaign that builds momentum too late. And we've seen that happen in a couple of races. It's incredibly important that we do it now. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, like I mentioned, like we made the most calls we've ever made in a single day, over 11,000 calls this weekend. That's the type of power that we need to be building right now. We can't be in a place where resources and endorsements or whatever else comes in at the last minute. We want to be ready and have that awareness strong and support strong before the end, because we've seen way too many campaigns that could have been won if maybe just a week or two or a month earlier they've gotten the support. So it's incredibly important to do that right now. One of the ways you can help do that is also to donate. You can chip in at justfordelaware.com/donate. Ask your friends, share the link. Like a dollar makes a difference. And I think, you know, also just thank you for joining me. These are really great questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to them all. I'll try to follow up in the chat. But next week I'll have another special guest, so it won't just be me talking to myself for an hour. I think those are a little more fun. We saw that, I believe, last week. So we'll have that another candidate for you to look forward to next Monday at 7:30. So keep an eye out for who that is and for the invite to that event. And I hope to see you next Monday. Please invite your friends. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you as always for these incredibly great questions. I really appreciate like how tough you guys are in every question that you ask. And it really helps me recognize that we have a really engaged group of people here in our state who want things to be better, and we can fight for them together. So thanks as always, and take care, and see you soon.